Around 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, a 57-year-old woman named Cash-Landrum rode in the front seat of her friend Betty Cash's car, while her 7-year-old grandson named Colby, who she was raising, sat between them. The three of them had just had dinner at a truck stop and were now on their way home, driving down a dark wooded highway near Huffman, Texas, which is a small town about 30 miles northeast of Houston. As they drove down the road, Vicky began to notice the windshield was fogging up from how cold it was outside and how warm it was inside the car. And so Vicky turned on the defroster. And as the windshield began to clear, Vicky noticed this bright light right out in front of them up over the trees. And at first, Vicky just figured, they were close to the Houston airport, and so that light must just be an airplane. But as the trio continued driving down this winding highway road, that light that Vicky really thought was a plane landing appeared to just kind of hover in the trees. And actually, as they drove, the light almost appeared to get closer and closer to them. So it didn't really seem like it was a plane. Now, at first, Vicky thought this was just kind of interesting and was curious about this light. But as they got closer and closer to this light, it became very obvious that the inside of the car was getting much warmer and stuffier than any of the heat settings would allow it to get, to the point where Vicky was actually sweating and panting from the heat. Now, all of this was happening really quickly, and so Vicky sort of went from being curious to being kind of anxious. Like, what was going on here? Like, does this light have something to do with the heat they're experiencing in the car? And then all of a sudden, the light that appeared to be sort of behind the trees suddenly came right out in front of the car, and Vicky screamed at Betty, "Stop!" And Becky jammed on the brakes, and they came to a stop, and blocking their path maybe 100 feet in front of them, just hovering over the road, is this strange looking aircraft aimed right at them. This craft was the strange light. For a moment, all three of them just stared in shock at this craft, like it was so unexpected and so unbelievable that this had happened. But then Vicky, who's sitting there still panting and sweating, she's looking out and she's realizing this craft she's looking at looks nothing like any other aircraft she had ever seen. The craft was a bit bigger than a car, it was diamond-shaped, and it was letting out these strange, loud roaring sounds, almost like an engine. It appeared to be glowing red hot, and periodically, with those loud roaring sounds it was making, fire would appear to shoot out the bottom of the craft, scorching the pavement right under it. And again, this strange craft is just hovering there right over the ground, appeared to be aimed directly at Vicky, Betty, and Colby. Pretty quickly, Colby began to cry. He was scared. But Betty, the driver, she said she couldn't go anywhere. The road was too thin. She couldn't really turn around very easily, and she couldn't drive straight and go under the craft and risk being burned by the flames. And so they were just kind of trapped there. And so Vicky and Betty sort of looked at each other like, okay, we're gonna wait it out and hope this craft just eventually flies away. But after several minutes, and the craft still had not departed, it was still blocking their way and periodically spitting fire into the ground, Vicky and Betty are like, well, let's get out and see what's going on here. Let's investigate. By this point, their fear and anxiety around this had sort of been replaced by just genuine human curiosity. I mean, what the heck is this thing? And so Betty, the driver, she gets out, and Vicky, she tells her grandson, stay in the car, so Colby's right here, and Vicky gets out, and the second she does, and she now has an unobstructed view at this craft, she suddenly remembered this Bible verse. So Vicky was very religious, and she had read in the Bible that one day Jesus would return to the earth, and when he did, he would return in a rain of fire. And so all of a sudden, Vicky believed that what she was looking at was not some aircraft, but the second coming of Jesus Christ. This was like a highly spiritual moment for her. But just as Vicky was about to go forward and actually inspect this thing up close, she heard Colby call out for her. He was crying hysterically. He was totally scared and upset. And so this kind of broke Vicky out of her trance. She turned around and went back to the car to comfort Colby. And when she got back to the car, she found Colby scrunched up on the floor underneath the dashboard like he was trying to shield himself from this craft. And so Vicky, she got right down there with him. She wrapped her arms around Colby and began praying with him to try to calm him down. But while Vicky and Colby were praying inside the car, Betty remained outside of the car, just staring at this craft. And it went on like this for about 10 minutes until Vicky, who's still tucked down there with Colby, heard that roaring sound coming from the aircraft get noticeably louder, like it was about to do something. And so Vicky poked her head up and she looked out the windshield, and sure enough, this craft was beginning to take off. It was getting higher and higher off the ground. Flames were shooting out the bottom of it. Betty was still outside staring at it. And then before long, long, this craft had shot straight up into the air and began taking off up and away from them at a really steep angle. And at the same time, Vicky suddenly saw this swarm of all these helicopters, these military-style helicopters, go right up around this craft, like they were escorting it. And then the craft and all these helicopters took off into the horizon and disappeared. After they were all gone, Vicky realized that what she had just witnessed was not the second coming of Christ. Because of these military helicopters that arrived as this craft took off, it told Vicky and also Betty that very likely this was just a US military exercise of some sort. And so a few moments later, Betty came back to the car and sat in the driver's seat, and Vicky, she climbed back into her seat and lifted Colby up to the middle seat as well. And for a moment, the three of them just sat there in silence. I mean, there's nothing blocking their way anymore. They're just sort of trying to process what just happened. Eventually, Betty just put the car in drive and began driving straight ahead, crossing right over that scorch mark on the pavement where the craft had been. About 45 minutes later, Betty pulled up to Vicky's house and parked the car. Vicky and Colby, they got out, they said goodbye to Betty. They didn't really talk about what they had just seen, they just said goodnight. And then Vicky and Colby headed inside the house. And as much as both of them did have things to say about whatever it was they saw, they just continued not to talk about it. They both were just kind of eager to go to bed. However, as Vicky was putting Colby to bed, he began to complain that his stomach hurt, and at the same time, Vicky began to realize that she also didn't feel very well. And shortly after that, both of them were vomiting in the bathroom. And this scared Vicky. She tried to tell herself that, maybe the reason they were sick is because they ate some bad food at that truck stop. But deep down, Vicky was very concerned that their nausea was somehow connected to that strange craft. And so it was a very long night, with Vicky and Colby being nauseous most of the time, but eventually they both did fall asleep. And then when Vicky got up the next morning, she still felt awful. And so Vicky, she rolled out of bed and made her way to the bathroom. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she gasped. Her skin was bright red and blistered, like she had had this horrible sunburn. At this point, she knew whatever was going on here, it had to do with that craft. She just knew it. And so Vicky instinctively rushed to Colby's room to check on him to see if his skin was all blistered and red, and she found he was still sleeping, but she could see his skin was red and blistered in some places, but not nearly as bad as Vicky's. And so Vicky, she began thinking about the night before, and she remembered she had gotten out of the car and gotten closer to the craft. So she was sort of more exposed to the craft, if you will, than Colby, who stayed in the car and tucked himself down underneath the dashboard the whole time. And so maybe Vicky's exposure to the craft was higher than Colby's, which is why she looked worse. But as Vicky was thinking this through, she remembered that Betty had actually stayed outside the car for 10-15 minutes, much longer than Vicky had, the whole time just staring directly at this craft. And so immediately Vicky was worried that, if this is what happened to me, I can only imagine what shape Betty is in. And so Vicky ran to the phone, she picked it up, and she dialed Betty's number, and she listened, and it just kept on ringing and ringing. Betty didn't answer. Now, at this point, Vicky was in a full-blown panic, not only because she was worried about Betty, but also, she doesn't really know what's wrong with her or with Colby. She doesn't know if their sickness is going to get worse or better. Currently, she felt horrible. She was nauseous. Her skin seemed to be practically falling off. Colby was in less bad shape, but still not healthy. And also, Vicky didn't have the money to even go to the doctor to get looked at. And so as much as Vicky really wanted right now to just go check on Betty, go drive to her house and check on her, she couldn't. She needed to focus on herself and her grandson first and make sure they were okay before she did anything else. And so over the next few days, Vicky and Colby stayed home. They slowly regained their strength. And over those few days, Vicky actually would get Betty on the phone. And Betty would tell her that yes, she's also dealing with similar symptoms, but she was okay, which was very reassuring to Vicky. However, Vicky also knew that Betty was not a complainer, and even if she did have horrendous symptoms, she was not the type of person who would necessarily tell Vicky. She would sort of tough it out. Finally, after 5 days, Vicky felt strong enough to go check on Betty in person. However, when she got to Betty's house and went inside, she called out for Betty, but there was no answer. The house was eerily quiet. And so Vicky began walking around Betty's house looking for Betty. And eventually, Vicky walked down a hallway and reached Betty's bedroom, and the door was shut. Vicky called out for Betty, but there was no answer from inside. And so feeling kind of scared at this point, Vicky reached down, she turned the handle and opened the door, and immediately she saw Betty on her bed. And Betty looked horrible. She was barely conscious. Her entire body was red and blistered and bleeding. There was vomit all over the bed sheets, and there were all these huge clumps of Betty's hair littering her pillow. And so Vicky was horrified. She rushed inside, she scooped her friend up, and between the two of them, they kind of hobbled out of the house. Vicky put Betty in her car, and they sped to the hospital. A few hours later, Vicky was waiting in the emergency room where Betty was being treated when Betty's doctor walked into the waiting room, at which point Vicky stood up and rushed over to him and said, "Hey, what's going on with Betty? What happened to her? What's going on?" But the doctor just shook his head and said, "Your friend, her skin is literally peeling off her face in sheets, and there are blisters breaking out all over her body." He told Vicky that her symptoms reminded him of radiation poisoning. However, he also told Vicky that that was basically impossible. For Betty, a woman who lives in rural Texas, where would she go to come in contact with something that radioactive? It just seemed not possible, so that couldn't be it. But Vicky, when she heard this, felt like she knew exactly how Betty came in contact with something highly radioactive. It had to be that craft. And so without even thinking about it, Vicky began pouring out the story of how her and Betty had seen this light, and then this craft appeared on the road, and it was shooting fire, and then it flew off with helicopters all around it. But as she was wrapping up her story, Vicky was suddenly overcome with embarrassment because the doctor was now staring at her like she was totally out of her mind. A month later, in early February of 1981, Vicky was at her kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear. She was calling her local senator, who she had already written to try to tell him about this strange aircraft she had seen that made her friend sick. But Vicky did not have high hopes about this phone call, because she had already been ignored so many times by so many people when it came to this story. So by this point, Vicky and her grandson Colby had basically recovered from their nausea and their burns. However, Betty had not recovered. She was still cycling in and out of the hospital. She was in constant pain. She still had burns all over her. And in fact, because of all these symptoms, she had had to move in with her brother. Now, Vicky was certain that all these symptoms Betty had were radiation sickness caused by the radiation from this aircraft they came in contact with. But it was like everybody they told about this aircraft didn't believe them. Just then, Vicky heard a woman's voice break through the hold music. It was the local senator's secretary. And so Vicky quickly explained why she was calling and why she really wanted to talk to the local senator. But the secretary just told Vicky that, yep, she'll pass this along to the senator and he'll be in touch. And then she hung up. And for Vicky, this was the moment she snapped. She felt like trying to navigate the proper channels to try to figure out what this aircraft was and what happened to Betty was not working, because clearly nobody was taking her seriously. And so Vicky slammed the phone down and just sat there frustrated, having no idea what to do. But as she sat there, Vicky remembered there was actually one place she had not called yet, specifically because she didn't want to call this place. It was a UFO research center. And Vicky hadn't called because she did not believe the craft she had seen was a UFO. She believed it was a military aircraft because she had seen the helicopters escorting it away, and that made the most sense. It had to be military. But if she called the UFO research center and people found out about that, it would make her look even crazier, because now she's claiming the craft was aliens or something. But now Vicky felt like she had run out of options. So she picked up the phone, grabbed the piece of paper with the number on it, and dialed. A couple days later, a scientist named John Schuessler drove down the winding wooded highway into Huffman, Texas. He was going to meet up with Vicky. John was an aerospace engineer for NASA. However, he also spent a lot of time investigating UFO sightings. Vicky's call to that UFO research center had created a lot of excitement in the UFO community, and the story had eventually found its way to John, who decided he would take on the case. Now, to be clear, John was not into researching UFO sightings in order to prove they really happened. Actually, it was sort of the opposite. He would look into reported UFO sightings in order to prove they were not UFOs. He would find a rational, scientific explanation that debunked the sighting. That's sort of what he did. And so with Vicky's case, that was his intention, to go to Huffman, Texas, talk to Vicky, and explain away with science and rationale what happened here. That this was not, aliens. This was something ordinary, like a government aircraft. And so John eventually got to Vicky's house, and he went inside and he chatted with Vicky, and she talked him through all the details of the story. And then eventually, they both left Vicky's house, they hopped in their respective cars, and headed out to go to the actual site where this had happened. And when they got there, and John got out of the car, he didn't need Vicky to direct him to the specific site, because right in front of him was this really obvious black circle right in the middle of the road, as if the road itself had been melted and then re-solidified and actually looked different. And Vicky said, that's where it was. That's where the craft was hovering. Those marks are from the craft. Now, this was great evidence that a craft really had been here, but John wanted more. He needed to figure out what kind of craft this really was. And so he told Vicky he was going to leave and go canvass the area for witnesses, and he told her he would keep her updated. So Vicky left, and John drove up the road until he reached some campsites and farmhouses. And John systematically went from door to door and tent to tent, asking anybody if they had seen or heard any aircraft or anything strange on the night of December 29th. Now, going into this, John didn't really know what to expect from these people he was asking. I mean, he's some random scientist showing up uninvited at people's homes, asking if they've seen strange lights in the sky. However, every single person he spoke to said that yes, they had seen that aircraft on December 29th. However, they were obviously just farther away than Vicky and Betty and Colby had been. So now, John felt like he had enough information to speak directly with military officials. However, when he contacted all the military bases in the area, all those officials he spoke to told him absolutely that on December 29th, there were 0 military operations happening. John found this very frustrating because to him, it seemed very clear that these officials were just lying to him. But what they were lying about and why was unclear. So John actually went to these military bases to speak to the officials face to face. And when he did, he showed them all the witness testimonies saying what they had seen on December 29th. And he also told them that with his own eyes, he had seen the black scorched mark on the pavement, where the pavement seemed to have literally melted in a ring and re-solidified from the heat of this craft. And to John, I mean, that scorch mark almost proved something had been there, very likely a military craft. But all these military leaders, despite hearing this and hearing John's testimony, they just said, you know what, you can gather up all the evidence you think you have here, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't prove that we were in the area. There was no military craft there that night. And so the bottom line was, the military was adamant they were not involved. And so the case really began to stall. John went home, but he couldn't stop thinking about the case, and so he kept in touch with his witnesses and periodically checked in with military officials, but nothing seemed to change. Except that Betty continued to get sicker and sicker, and Vicky actually began to develop other serious symptoms, like developing cataracts in one of her eyes. And then John got a frantic call from one of his witnesses. They told him they had just seen something truly incredible. And as John listened to the story, he felt his heart sink, because now he knew the military had been lying to him about being out there on December 29th. Clearly they had been, and very likely it was their aircraft that had made Betty, Vicky, and Colby so sick. But now, John also knew that any hope he had of proving this was now literally gone, because the witness told him that black government vehicles had rolled up to the incident site out on that road, and they'd come along with construction vehicles, and for no clear traffic-related reason, they had cut up one particular stretch of that road, taken it with them, and left. And that particular stretch of road that was removed just happened to be the exact spot where that scorch mark had been left by the craft. It was like they were taking the evidence and getting rid of it. Now, John himself was not able to literally go back to the road and see for himself where the pavement had been cut. However, not long after John learned this information, a group of UFO scientists descended on the road to find this scorch mark, or to prove it had been cut out and taken away like the witness had said. And sure enough, when they got out there, they didn't find the scorch mark. Instead, they found nice, fresh, brand new pavement. The strange event that Vicky, Betty, and Colby experienced on the night of December 29, 1980, is widely considered to be one of the most famous and credible UFO sightings of all time. It's now known as the Cash-Landrum incident, after Betty and Vicky's last names, and to this day, nobody has been able to come up with a rational explanation for what happened if it wasn't a UFO. To this day, the US government maintains that they did not have any military operations happening on December 29th. However, they did say when it comes to cutting out the road and paving over it, that that was just for routine maintenance. They were not trying to hide evidence. As for Vicky and Betty, over the years, their health continued to deteriorate. They ultimately filed a lawsuit against the government, but because they couldn't actually prove that the aircraft even existed or that it caused their health problems, their lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Both women would eventually die from cancer, which Colby believes is a direct result from radiation exposure. As for Colby, he's still alive and continuing to seek answers. Before dawn on December 12, 1992, a 17-year-old girl named Tracy Dion sat in the passenger seat of a little two-door car that was swerving down a deserted road in the Yankton Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. Everybody in the car was drunk, including Tracy. Sitting next to Tracy in the middle front seat was her 19-year-old cousin named Ruby, and Ruby's boyfriend, a 20-year-old named Arnold, was driving the car. All three of them had been out partying all night, and so now they were trying to make it home. The swerving was making Tracy feel sick to her stomach, but she didn't want to say anything to Arnold in fear that she might distract him. I mean, it was really dark outside, there was no streetlights, there was ice on the road. I mean, for a sober driver, this would be a challenging drive, let alone a drunk driver. They were coming up on an intersection, and Arnold brought the car to a stop with a lurch. Tracy watched as Arnold checked for cross traffic and then pulled out onto Highway 281. But halfway through this turn, as Arnold was accelerating, Tracy began to feel the car slide. And even in her drunken state, she could tell Arnold had hit a patch of black ice. And so as the car began to skid, she wanted to scream, but before she could, the car was already flipping over, and then everything went black. A short time later, Tracy came to. The car was upside down, and Tracy quickly realized she had fallen out of her seat and was now basically resting on the roof of the car, which was now on the ground. From what she could tell, after the car had finished rolling over, it had come to a stop just off the side of the highway, and so they were not in immediate danger from other cars striking them, but she couldn't really see outside because the windows were so badly cracked. Beside her, Tracy could hear her cousin, Ruby, pounding on the driver's side door trying to get it to open, and so Tracy tried to look around Ruby to see Arnold to see if he was okay, but when she did, she saw the driver's seat was empty. Tracy tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The driver's side door was closed, but Arnold was gone. Just then, Tracy heard the sound of the driver's side door opening, and she turned to see her cousin Ruby forcing the door open just a few inches, and then a second later, Ruby was slithering out through that crack to the outside. To Tracy, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. She was too shocked and confused to make any sense of it. But if Ruby was getting out of the car, Tracy felt like she should too. And so Tracy turned and crawled across to the driver's side and was about to make an exit the same way Ruby had when the door slammed shut violently right in Tracy's face. Tracy didn't understand why Ruby would do something like that. Why would she shut the door that aggressively when she knew her cousin was still inside? Tracy tried to open the door again, but she was too weak to do it. She figured her cousin Ruby was okay, but she couldn't see outside because of how cracked the windows were. At this point, Tracy began to feel woozy. She laid her head down on the roof of the car, wondering to herself why Ruby and Arnold had left her behind. Tracy would stay trapped inside of the car, alone, for a few hours, until finally a motorist saw the flipped-over car and called 911. Shortly after that, first responders arrived on the scene, they pulled Tracy out of the car, and shockingly, she actually didn't have really any serious injuries at all. She didn't even need to be hospitalized. But rescuers could not find Ruby or Arnold anywhere. They were gone. And once rescuers had scoured the entire area around the crash site, the sheriff who was in charge of the scene started to wonder if Arnold and Ruby were not just missing. Maybe, he thought, they had fled. Arnold had been driving drunk, and all three of them were underage, and so the sheriff thought maybe Arnold and Ruby were scared to get in trouble. Over the next few days, the police continued to search the surrounding area for Arnold and Ruby, hoping they were not badly injured and that they would just turn up on their own, but they never did. And as the days turned into weeks, hope began to wane for the young couple. Their family and friends kept searching the area along 281 where the car had flipped, looking for any clue as to where these two had gone. But there was nothing. There was no trace of them. It was like Arnold and Ruby had gotten out of the car and just vanished. But in January of 1993, so 3 weeks after the crash, strange and conflicting reports of sightings began to trickle in. First, a woman came forward claiming to have seen Arnold, alive and well, at a New Year's Eve party. Now, the police doubted this claim, but this woman was insistent that she had seen Arnold, and they actually hooked her up to a lie detector test, and she passed the test. And so officials brought in guests from this party who this woman claimed were with Arnold, and they asked them, "Were you with Arnold?" And they said no, but they failed their lie detector tests. Now, of course, this was suspicious, but police really didn't know what to do with this information. Assuming this woman's story was true, that she really did see Arnold, well, according to the details of her story, Arnold did not appear to be in any kind of distress. And even if he was in distress, the police still had no idea where he was, so how could they help him? Other locals came forward, claiming to have spotted Arnold around town as well. But nothing came of those reports either. Neither Arnold nor Ruby turned up. Months went by, and the case went cold. Until March 10th, when a driver was going down Highway 281 and they noticed a strange object in the drainage ditch next to the road. By now, the weather was much warmer than it had been on the day of the crash. So instead of snow and ice inside of this drainage ditch, it was runoff water, and the strange object was floating in it. The driver stopped his car, got out, and walked up to see what this thing was, and as soon as he saw it, he turned, ran back to his car, and called the police. Because what the driver had just found was a dead body. And when the police arrived and searched the area, they found another body not far away. The bodies belonged to Ruby and Arnold. But this discovery did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ruby and Arnold. Instead, it made it much more bizarre. Because first of all, the bodies were found 75 feet away from the original crash site. And the exact spots where the two bodies were found had been searched many, many times on the day of the crash, days after the crash. They were searched by police, they were searched by friends and family of Ruby and Arnold. The idea that this is where the bodies had been the whole time was impossible. They would have been found. And then there was the condition of the bodies. Ruby's body was extremely decomposed, which made sense given the fact that the crash was 3 months earlier. But Arnold's body was barely decomposed at all. And in the pocket of Arnold's jeans, police found a mysterious set of 3 keys. 1 was a vehicle key and 2 were house keys. But none of them opened any vehicle or building that Arnold was known to frequent, and nobody recognized them. Finally, the police found a tuft of hair lying near where the bodies had been found. It was Ruby's hair, but it didn't look like the hair had been there for very long, certainly not 3 months. Instead of being dirty and matted, like you would expect given how long she must have been there, the hair was perfectly clean. The official coroner's report on Ruby and Arnold's deaths were that they died of exposure, and then their bodies were just overlooked by searchers for months. But to a lot of people, including the sheriff who was in charge of the original crash site, this made no sense. Despite the coroner's findings, law enforcement officials believed that Ruby and Arnold's deaths were the result of foul play. Under the foul play theory, somebody pulled Ruby and Arnold out of the crash site while they were still alive, and then killed them later. And then perhaps they killed them at different times, which would account for the differences in decomposition of their bodies. The FBI ultimately came in and took over this case, but they eventually closed it down, citing a lack of evidence to support the foul play theory. However, with or without foul play being involved here, nobody has a good explanation for all those sightings of Arnold after the crash. And also, nobody can explain why the door was slammed in Tracy's face in the immediate aftermath of the crash. Maybe it was Ruby or Arnold who slammed the door, or maybe it was their killer. To this day, what actually happened on December 12, 1992, on the side of Highway 281 remains a mystery. On the afternoon of July 18, 1997, a man was driving down a road surrounded on both sides by trees in a rural part of Wisconsin called Douglas County. There were no other cars on the road, and so this guy was driving pretty fast. And as he rounded this bend in the road, something out the passenger side window on the side of the road in the grass caught his eye. He couldn't tell what it was, but it was a pretty big object, and after he drove right past it, he just couldn't stop thinking about it. Like, whatever it was, it just seemed out of place. And so for whatever reason, this man felt compelled to actually stop and go see what it was. And so he slowed down and parked on the shoulder, he got out, and began walking along the road back in the direction of this object. And as he got closer, he began to see this object again in the shoulder of the road, and it was sort of obscured by grass and other things, so he couldn't see what it was. But as he got closer, he saw the object was pretty big, and it was all white. And as he took a few more steps and got within maybe 20 or 30 feet, he finally got a better look at this object, and he just froze. Because the object was a man wearing all white, a white suit, a white belt, white shoes, all white, and he was laying on the side of the road, just totally motionless. And for a second, the driver thought, maybe this guy is sleeping, but after taking only a few more steps and getting a totally unobstructed view at this guy, he saw there was a gaping hole in this man's chest. He was obviously dead. And so the driver turned around, ran back to his car, sped to the nearest house, and called 911. The next morning, a Douglas County detective named Stephen Long was sitting at his desk looking at the photos of the dead man in white. This murder case was less than 24 hours old, but already this was one of the weirder cases that this detective had ever been assigned to. The victim had pretty much immediately been identified because he was carrying on his person his wallet, and in his wallet was his driver's license, and so they knew who he was. But the man in white's identity actually made the whole case more confusing, not less. And Mark had no obvious ties to the area, so what was this rich guy doing 3 hours from home, dressed all in white, getting shot to death on the side of the road? Like, it didn't add up. The dead man was a 45-year-old millionaire named Mark Foster, and Mark lived 3 hours away in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and had no discernible ties to Douglas County, and so the detective was thinking, what is this rich guy doing here, dressed head to toe, all in white, getting murdered on the side of some local random back road? But things only got more confusing from there. After the medical examiner did Mark's autopsy, he told Detective Long that he had discovered a note inside of Mark's shoe. And the note just said, "Jack Frazier isn't here, but it's Jimmy Bailey? Or a lookalike? I hope I'm okay." Now, nobody, including Detective Long, had any idea what this note meant. It was far too cryptic. But when they ran Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey's names through their database, the police discovered that both of those men, one, existed, and two, they lived in Minnesota, same as Mark Foster. And so naturally, Detective Long began to suspect that maybe those two men were connected in some way to Mark Foster. Maybe they were involved in his murder, or maybe they were actually his killer or killers. He didn't know, but it was his best lead. So Detective Long decided he would just have to go to Minneapolis to try to find out more. A few hours later, Detective Long parked his car at the Minneapolis police station. He got out and walked inside the building. Waiting for him inside was the local detective who Mark had already spoken to. And so after meeting this detective, the two of them went into an interview room where Mark Foster's wife was waiting for them. And right away, Detective Long noticed that she was very pregnant and at least 15 or 20 years younger than Mark. But despite that, she seemed very composed. It would turn out she had already been told about her husband's death, and she was basically resigned to the fact that she was here to try to answer questions to figure out what happened. And so the detective sat down and they began to interview her. And then when they brought up the note that was found in Mark's shoe, specifically when they said the two names that were on that note, Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey, when they said that, it triggered something in Mark Foster's wife. She immediately began to cry, and then in between sobs, she would tell the detectives that she knew who those two men were. She told them that she had previously had relationships with both of them before marrying Mark. And she said after she married Mark, Jack and Jimmy became very jealous. They didn't like the idea that she had chosen Mark over them. And so she had always felt like those two, Jack and Jimmy, sort of had it out for Mark as a result of this romantic rivalry. After the interview with Mark's wife ended, Detective Long began to think that, despite this case appearing on the surface to be very odd and confusing, that perhaps in reality, it was quite simple. Maybe Jimmy and Jack were so jealous of Mark that they killed Mark. Based on what Mark's wife had just told them in the interview about them being romantic rivals of Mark, and also the fact that that note was in Mark's shoe and named those two men, it certainly seemed very possible. But over the next couple of days that Detective Long began digging into this theory, that theory fell apart. Because it would turn out Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey had absolutely airtight alibis. They simply couldn't have been the killers. Now, Detective Long was obviously frustrated. He felt like he really had it here. But he was not deterred. He decided his next move would be to try to better understand his victim. To this point, he had already interviewed a lot of Mark's friends and family, but something he had not done yet was simply go to Mark's house and have a look around. So Detective Long got a search warrant, and on July 29th, roughly a week after Mark was killed, Detective Long, along with another detective, pulled up in front of Mark Foster's large 2-story home in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Now, from the outside, The home looked totally ordinary relative to its neighbors. But once they got inside the house, it was anything but. The detectives made their way up to the front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, Mark Foster's wife opened up the door and let them inside. And right away, Detective Long is looking around, and he's seeing all over the walls on the first floor of the house are these graphic pictures and paintings of naked people. And then in addition to that, on some of the coffee tables and various surfaces on the first floor, right when you walk in, are all these pornographic magazines and books everywhere. And Mark's wife didn't acknowledge any of it. She acted like it was completely normal to have all this stuff right in the front part of your house. And so the two detectives are looking at each other as, Mark's wife is leading them on this tour through the first floor. And at some point, Detective Long just said, hey, Mrs. Foster, why don't you have a seat on the couch and you just let us take a look around your house on our own? And so she said, okay. She sat down on the couch, and then the two detectives, they left the living room, went back to the front of the house, and made their way upstairs. And once they got upstairs, they found the master suite, and there was all this bondage gear inside. There were leather straps attached to the bedposts, there was whips and handcuffs, there was also additional pornographic material in there. But, considering what the detectives had seen downstairs, this sort of felt on par for this house. And so after searching the other bedrooms and other rooms on the second floor and finding more pornographic material basically everywhere, the detectives found their way back to the hallway in the second floor, and they noticed there was a rope hanging down from the ceiling, and it was attached to the pull door that led to the attic. And so the two detectives, they walked over, they pulled the rope down, it revealed this fold-out set of stairs that came down from the attic, and once those were in place, the two detectives began climbing up. And once they got up there, they discovered that this attic was not a storage space like many attics are in American homes. Instead, this attic was a fully functional room that sort of resembled like a satanic dungeon of sorts. All the walls were totally jet black, and there were all these burned out candles all over the place and tarot cards littering the floor. And on the back of the attic, basically all the way on the other side, there was what appeared to be an altar that sort of overlooked the entire room. And on the altar were more candles, and there was a voodoo doll. It's totally creepy, and the two detectives are looking at each other like, what's going on here? And so the detectives, they climbed all the way into the attic, and then slowly began walking across towards the altar. And when they got close enough to actually see the altar up close, they just froze. Because sitting on the altar, in addition to the candles and the voodoo doll, were two business cards. Their own business cards. Detective Long and his partner immediately went downstairs and confronted Mark's wife about the attic. Like, what's going on up there? Why are our business cards on your altar? But Mark's wife, the second that attic was mentioned, went silent. She refused to speak about anything to do with the attic. And so after a minute, realizing this conversation was going nowhere, Detective Long and his partner called for backup. And as they waited for backup, the two of them stepped away from Mark's wife and began speculating like, is this a cult? Was Mark a part of a cult that ran it out of his attic? Like, what's going on here? And are we being targeted by the cult? Is that why our names are on the altar? A few minutes later, backup arrived, and they would do a much more extensive search of the property. But other than finding more pornographic materials and, bondage gear, there really wasn't anything else substantive that connected Mark or his wife to what happened to Mark, or what Mark was even doing in this house. Was he in a cult? They didn't know. And so ultimately, Detective Long and his partner told Mark's wife, who still is being quiet at this point, that she should not leave town because they were going to follow up with her soon. Now, in fairness, Detective Long couldn't tell if Mark's wife was being silent and not talking about what was going on in her house because, she was complicit in some way in what happened to Mark, or if she was maybe being threatened by somebody and she was afraid to talk. They didn't know. But either way, after leaving the property after the search was over, Detective Long and his partner felt like their next move was to try to learn more about cults. They needed a cult expert. And it just so happened there was an occult bookstore very close to Mark's house. And so they decided they would start there. And right away, their decision to go to that bookstore paid dividends, but not how the detectives expected. It would turn out the owner of that bookstore was indeed a cult expert. But much more importantly, and relevant to this case, was that the owner happened to personally know Mark Foster. And he told the detectives that Mark came to his bookstore all the time, and also the owner said he knew a bunch of Mark's friends. And so by the time the detectives left the bookstore, they had learned a little bit about cults, but more importantly, they left with a list of names the owner had given them of known associates of Mark Foster who maybe were involved in whatever was going on in Mark's house, and so maybe they had information about what happened to Mark. The detectives were able to track down everybody on this list very quickly, and they were all young people in their 20s. And in each of the interviews they conducted, each of these young people were very open about being in what they called a religious group that they said Mark was a part of as well. Now, the detectives theorized that this religious group was very likely a cult, like they believed, but they didn't call it a cult. They called it a group. But the detectives didn't let up. They kept pressing these people until eventually a new name surfaced, Greg Freisner. Now, none of these people said Greg was in charge of the cult. Instead, they just sort of said, well, talk to Greg if you want more information about our group. The detectives naturally began to wonder if this Greg person was the cult leader, or maybe he was Mark's killer, or maybe he was both. But regardless, it seemed pretty apparent that they needed to talk to Greg because he might have more information about what happened to Mark. It took a few days, but the detectives were able to track Greg down, and they brought him in for an interview. And boy, oh boy, did Greg have a story to tell. Based on what Greg told the detectives, here is what happened to Mark on the day that he died, on July 18th, 1997. On that day, Greg Freisner met Mark Foster at Mark's home. And when Mark came outside, he was dressed head to toe in white, something he would do for special ceremonies. And so Mark, he came down the steps, didn't say a word to Greg. They went to Greg's car. Greg hopped in the driver's seat, and Mark climbed into the back seat. And before long, they took off and began driving northeast. And for hours, these two just drove in total silence. Mark just stared out the window, and Greg focused on driving. The only thing that happened during this multi-hour-long drive was at some point Mark pulled out a piece of paper from his coat pocket, and he wrote something on it, and then after staring at it, he kind of smiled and tucked it into his shoe. And then a little bit later, Greg pulled over on the side of the road in Douglas County, Wisconsin, on this random backcountry road. And as soon as they pulled over, again without saying anything, Greg and Mark got out of the car and they went around to the back of the car where the trunk was. And the two men are kind of stretching, it's been a long drive, taking in the scenery. And then before long, Greg pops open the trunk. And in the trunk is a rifle. Neither man have any strong reaction to this. Greg just reaches down, pulls the rifle out, and Mark, calm as can be, just begins walking over to the side of the road, to the shoulder. And then once he got to the shoulder, Greg came over and stood right in front of him and just looked intently into Mark's eyes, looking for the signal. And at some point, after Mark kind of composed himself, he nodded at Greg, at which point Greg raised that rifle, placed the barrel directly on Mark's chest, and fired. Mark crumpled to the ground, and he laid there for a second just moaning horribly, and Greg just stood over him watching until finally Mark went silent and died, at which point Greg casually went back to his car, got inside, and drove home. The only time he stopped was to throw his rifle into a nearby river. But once Greg got home, he was overjoyed because he knew the sacred ritual he had just carried out with Mark had been a total success. It had gone exactly to plan. It would turn out Mark Foster was absolutely a member of that religious group, the cult, if you will. Except he was not just a member. He was the cult's leader. And Mark is the one who orchestrated his own death. However, Mark did not view his death as him actually dying. Quite the opposite.
We celebrate life as we celebrate death. Death is nothing to be afraid of. Death is a great crossroads, a change in attitude, a change in longitude, a change in the way that we perceive our spirit. When we reach that portal, they'll ring some golden bells.
He believed that what he and Greg, his most devout follower, were going to do, this sacred ritual, was after Greg fires the shot into his chest and ends this body's life, that his soul, his consciousness, and his power will be transferred into Greg. Basically, his soul will go into Greg. And Mark believed once this transfer happened, that basically he would be immortal, that his soul would never die. It would stay in Greg and then maybe at some point get transferred to somebody else, but basically he would be here forever. The bizarre note that was found in Mark's shoe, the note that he wrote and stuffed in there, that note was designed to throw police off the trail. He knew that he was having Greg murder him, again for this ritual, but he wanted to make sure Greg didn't get caught. And so he wrote on the note very specifically Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey. Those two people he hated. He hated that they had been in past relationships with his wife, and they hated him. And so he figured if he was going to create a scapegoat for his murder, who better than his romantic rivals? They had nothing to do with it. He just named them in that cryptic note to get them in trouble. As for all the pornography and bondage gear that was found inside of Mark's home, well, that all played a role in Mark's cult as well. He was a firm believer that the more sex he had with his followers, often multiple followers at the same time, the more powerful he would become. As for the detective's business cards found on the altar up in the attic, those were very likely placed there by followers of Mark, so members of the cult, in an effort to potentially, thwart their efforts to solve the case. They might have believed that by placing those on there and performing various rituals, that somehow would prevent them from solving the case. We don't know for sure. That's the theory around why they were there, but obviously that didn't work because the detectives solved the case. Greg Freisner would ultimately be found guilty for playing a role in Mark's death. He obviously was the triggerman, and so he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As for Mark's wife, although she definitely knew about the cult and may have been a participant, there was never any evidence that actually connected her to Mark's murder, and so she was never charged with any crime.